Mercedes just broke Formula One, and Verstappen might have just revealed how. Not with data. Not with an official complaint. With something much more dangerous. The truth about these cars. Because while his Red Bull was falling apart, unstable, unpredictable, ending in a total loss of power, Mercedes looked untouchable. Perfect. A 1-2 finish. Complete control from start to finish. And here's the detail that changed everything. They never ran out of energy. Not once. While every other team was lifting, managing, losing power at the end of straights, Mercedes kept pushing. Flat out. Lap after lap. And in a regulation designed to limit exactly that. That's a problem. Now add Verstappen's words. He said driving these cars feels like survival. So now the entire paddock is asking one question. If everyone is fighting the car, why aren't Mercedes? Because there are only two possibilities. They've solved Formula One before anyone else, or they found something no one was supposed to find. And now, the FIA is watching closely. Rival teams are already questioning. And what happened in China might be the moment everything started to unravel. What makes this even more shocking is that Verstappen didn't just lose a race. He revealed a contradiction. A massive one. Because everything he described after China points in the opposite direction of what Mercedes showed on track. Think about it. He talks about instability. About cars that feel heavy, unpredictable, difficult to trust. About constantly managing energy. Constantly adapting. Constantly surviving. And then you look at Mercedes. And you see none of that. No corrections mid-corner. No hesitation on throttle. No visible struggle with the system. Just smooth, controlled, repeatable performance. Lap after lap. And that contrast is where everything starts to break. Because in Formula One, when one team is fighting the car, and another looks like they've mastered it completely, something doesn't add up. Now go back to the race. Verstappen is recovering. Fighting through traffic. Managing tires. Trying to stay inside a very narrow window. And just when it looks like he might salvage something, the power disappears. Completely. Race over. Meanwhile, Antonelli is leading. Calm. Building a gap. Never under real pressure. Russell behind him. No urgency. No instability. Just control. And that difference is not normal. Now here's where it becomes even more important. Because this is not just about speed. It's about how that speed is sustained. In this generation of Formula One, energy is the limit. You deploy it, and at some point, you run out. That's the system. That's what keeps everything balanced. But in China, Mercedes didn't behave like they had that limit. They deployed longer, held power deeper into the straight, and most importantly, they repeated it. Over and over again. And that's exactly what engineers notice first. Not peak speed. Consistency. Because consistency like that doesn't happen by accident. Now connect this to Verstappen again. Because his words define the baseline. He's describing what these cars are supposed to feel like. Difficult. Unstable. Demanding. And by doing that, he highlights how far Mercedes is from that reality. Because if he's fighting the system, and Mercedes isn't, then one of them is operating in a completely different window. And that's where everything escalates. Because teams are already analyzing, looking at telemetry, comparing energy curves, trying to understand one thing. How is Mercedes sustaining that performance? And if they can't find the answer, they won't accept it. They will question it. That's how this sport works. So now the story is no longer about a dominant weekend. It's about a contradiction. Two completely different realities. Under the same rules. And when that happens, Formula One always reacts. So the real question is not whether Mercedes is fast. The real question is, how are they making something so limited look unlimited? Because if the answer to that question goes beyond what the rules intended, then what happened in China was not just dominance. It was a signal. A signal that something deeper has already been discovered. And once something like that appears in Formula One, it never stays hidden for long. But here's where this stops being just a performance story and becomes something much bigger. Because once a contradiction like this appears, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads across the entire sport, into engineering meetings, into data comparisons, into quiet conversations between teams and the FIA. Because now, it's not just about Mercedes being fast. It's about whether what they're doing should be possible at all. Now imagine what rival teams are seeing in their data. They look at their own cars, and they see limits. Energy fading, deployment dropping, drivers adapting. Then they overlay Mercedes, and the pattern changes. Smoother curves, longer deployment, less variation. And that's when the questions start. Not publicly, not aggressively, but persistently. Because if you can't replicate an advantage, you don't accept it. You challenge it. Now bring the FIA into this. Because their job is not just to enforce rules. It's to protect the balance. And when one team suddenly steps outside the expected behavior, they take notice. Quietly, but very seriously. Now here's the key detail. The FIA doesn't need to find something illegal. They only need to find something unclear. A gray area. An interpretation. Because in Formula One, that's where the biggest advantages live. And once those areas become too powerful, they get closed. Now imagine what that means for Mercedes. If their dominance comes from a very precise way of managing energy, a specific interaction between systems, then even a small clarification changes everything. Not gradually. Immediately. Because you're not just losing performance. You're losing the method that creates it. And that's much harder to recover. Now connect this back to China. Because what we saw there was not just speed. It was control. Perfect control. Every lap looked the same. Every straight delivered the same power. Every phase of the race, predictable. And in a system designed to be unpredictable, that stands out. Now add Verstappen's perspective one last time. Because his words are no longer just frustration. They are context. They define what these cars feel like for everyone else. Difficult. Unstable. Demanding. And by doing that, they make Mercedes look even more extreme. Because if that is the reality, then Mercedes is operating outside of it. Again, not necessarily illegal, but different. And in Formula One, different is never left alone. So now everything leads to one moment. The next race. Because that's where pressure becomes visible. If Mercedes shows up, and looks exactly the same, then they've done something extraordinary. Something the rest of the grid hasn't even understood yet. But if something changes, if the energy fades earlier, if the car looks slightly harder to drive, if the gap begins to close, then we will know that what happened in China was not just dominance. It was a moment. A moment where Mercedes reached a level that forced the entire sport to react. And once Formula One reacts, nothing stays the same. And if there is one thing Formula One has proven again and again, it's that advantages like this never stay untouched. Not when they're this visible. Not when they're this early. And definitely not when they create this level of contrast. Because what happened in China wasn't subtle. It wasn't something hidden deep in the data. It was obvious. A car that never seemed to reach its limit. In a sport built entirely around limits. And that's exactly why this moment matters so much. Because now, the entire system is reacting. Quietly, but decisively. More sensors. More data checks. More comparisons between teams. Because the FIA doesn't guess. They verify. They build a picture over time. And once that picture becomes clear, they act. Now imagine what that means over the next few races. Mercedes arrives at each circuit, carrying more than just performance. They carry attention. Every run is analyzed. Every gain is questioned. Every advantage is measured. And that creates a different kind of pressure. Not from rivals. From the system itself. Because now, they are not just racing to win. They are racing to prove something. That what they found can survive scrutiny. Now here's where it becomes even more intense. Because the rest of the grid is not standing still. Red Bull is working to fix the instability Verstappen described. Ferrari is already close, just missing that final step. And others are learning, fast. So even without FIA pressure, the gap was already under threat. But with that pressure, it becomes even harder to maintain. Now imagine the next race again. Not as a continuation, but as a test. A real one. Because now we are not asking, how fast is Mercedes? We are asking, how stable is their advantage? Because stability is what wins championships. Now picture the moment. Lights out. Race begins. Mercedes leads again. At first, everything looks the same. Smooth. Controlled. Untouchable. But then, a small detail. Maybe the energy doesn't last as long. Maybe the gap doesn't grow the same way. Maybe the car looks just slightly more alive, more difficult. Nothing dramatic. But enough. Enough to tell you, something has shifted. And that's how Formula One reveals the truth. Not with statements. Not with headlines. With differences. Small ones. That grow over time. Now bring everything back to the core of this story. Verstappen didn't just complain. He defined the baseline. He described what these cars are supposed to feel like. And by doing that, he created the perfect comparison. Because now, everyone knows what normal looks like. And Mercedes doesn't look normal. So now everything comes down to one final question. Was China the beginning of a new Mercedes era? Or was it the peak of something that the sport is already starting to control? Because the answer is coming. Not in words, not in interviews, but on track. And when it arrives, it won't just explain China. It will define the entire season. And this is the moment where everything finally gets decided. Because by now, there is no more hiding. No more benefit of the doubt. No more surprise. Only confirmation. Because Formula One doesn't move backwards. Once something is exposed, it gets tested, pushed, challenged, until the truth shows itself. Now imagine the next phase of the season. Not just one race. Several. Different layouts. Different demands. High-speed tracks. Technical circuits. Heavy braking zones. Long straights. Every possible scenario. Because if Mercedes' advantage is real, it has to survive all of it. And if it doesn't, it will break. Now picture that evolution. Race after race. The gap either stays, or it slowly disappears. And that's where everything becomes clear. Because dominance is easy to see, but losing it is even easier. It doesn't vanish instantly. It fades. A few tenths at first, then a few more, until suddenly, the fight is back. Now here's the final layer. Because this is not just about Mercedes anymore. It's about the entire grid reacting, learning, adapting. Because even if Mercedes did nothing wrong, the moment they revealed what's possible, everyone else started chasing it. And that changes the sport. Because now, it's not just about catching Mercedes. It's about understanding the system at the same level. And once that happens, everything compresses. Now bring Verstappen into this one last time. Because his words started all of this. He described chaos, instability, a car that feels like survival. And by doing that, he defined the limit, the edge of what these cars are supposed to be. And Mercedes stepped beyond it, whether through brilliance or something else. That's the question. But the fact that they did is no longer a debate. So now, we arrive at the real conclusion. China was not just a race. It was a reveal. A moment where one team showed the maximum potential of this new era and forced everyone else to react. The FIA, the teams, the drivers, everyone. And from that moment on, nothing stays the same. Because in Formula One, once the limit is found, it either becomes the new standard or it gets pulled back. There is no middle ground. So now everything comes down to this. If Mercedes keeps that performance, they define the future. If they don't, then what we saw in China was not the beginning. It was the peak. A moment in time where everything aligned, right before the sport closed in.